Hailing from the days of Medarot 3, this Earthcrawler comes back to guarantee that while he's on the field, anyone with particular use of heavy parts is going to be absolutely feeling the pain. It is CTP00 Centipade, with a kit of triple press, wheeled legs, and the leg ability of artillery, which buffs the success and power of shooting skills, but in trade cannot dodge or defend while in heat phase. Now, Centipade is a model that has not seen the light of day since essentially Medarots 3 and 4, and this is his very first appearance into the world of 3D with Medarot S. So even though he is an event reward that anybody can walk home with from the event at time of recording, he still can be a very solid model and still a very nice model on top of that when it comes to how he was introduced in the game and what he brings to the table. Press on all three of his parts, head and both arms, is a gravity attribute shooting skill that tends to focus on its mastery in heavy punish. This means that if you are attacking a foe with at least 2 or more heavy parts, they are absolutely going to be feeling the pain of the weight with bonus punish damage on top of that. But if they are only holding 1 or none, unfortunately probably won't be dealing a lot of damage, if any at all. Gravity attacks are also pretty remarkably well known for their ability and tie to success relative to Metaforce charge. So the more charge that Centipade has in his gauge when firing, not only is it more likely that his hits are going to land pretty consistently, but they're also going to have a higher chance of landing critical hits on top of that. The only real problem with Press, though, in comparison to other skills such as Break Rush or Break Hammer, or even Wide Break, is the fact that Press does not have pierce damage on it, which will very severely hinder a lot of what Centipade can bring to the table. However, it is also worth noting that in trade of not having pierce, it does also have a higher success bonus tied to charge. So instead of getting that times 1.5 and times 2 that Break will get, Press instead gets a times 2 and a times 3. So Centipade may not focusing on dealing a lot of, say, carryover or punish damage, but he's going to be focusing primarily as a spot nuker more than anything else. Wheeled legs means that Centipade will have relatively picky coverage across most terrains, as wheeled legs tend to focus on having a high base mobility, but also, unfortunately, terrible terrain coverage, having only 2 really at best, and that's including cyber, terrains that they're really good on at most, and on any other terrain, probably not nearly as good as they really can be. Now, when it comes to his stats across the board, though, Centipade is actually a pretty chunky fellow despite his very, lanky appearance, I suppose I can call it. A base speed and mobility of 862 is nice and essentially par for the course of where wheeled legs tend to want to sit, so he already has a really good foot in the speed department while he's on the field. An evade of 873 also is pretty nice. Not the greatest it could be, but he will have a pretty decent time dodging or grazing when he can, but with basically 5 sets of wheels on that chunky leg of his, I can definitely understand why he wouldn't be really quick on the dodge or the graze when people are coming to attack him. A melee resist of 841 also isn't super great either, but it's also not terrible. Just exercise caution if he's fighting anybody at close range. But a shoot resist of 1404 does make up for that fairly well, as he can exchange blows pretty decently with enemies from afar, as long as they aren't catching him on the backswing. Now, that is also before the leg ability of artillery comes into effect. While the boost to success and power to shooting skills, which, would you look at that, he's triple shooting, is going to be very nice, and it does mean he's going to hit pretty notably harder than what the numbers here are actually listing. It does also come with a caveat, and that caveat that you see there is the second half of that sentence. They cannot dodge or defend while they are in heat phase. That does mean that aside from any other cooldown penalty that Centipade will be having, he also is basically making himself a very wide open target as long as he's in his heat phase, and very easy and susceptible to counter or punish if anyone ends up being faster than him. And if the enemy is faster than your shielder to protect Centipade, well, guess what? He's probably going to be crushed like the worm he is pretty quickly. All this being said, though, as a pure set score, I unfortunately have to rate Centipade a pretty low 4 out of 10, and it's kind of unfortunate I have to grade a model. I actually don't remember the last time I've had to grade a model this low, but Unfortunately, as nice as it is to have Centipade in the game, there's just a lot of things that are holding him back from really being able to bring a lot of potential to the table. Having press on all 3 of his parts does mean that he is going to be kind of redundant here based on what skill he chooses to use, and the fact that he doesn't have pierce damage on any of them means his utility is going to be very severely hindered and limited at best. And if the enemy isn't packing any heavy parts more than 2, Centipade is just going to be kind of sitting there more than anything else. But he is relatively chunky, though, I should say, with armor in the mid 3400s between all 3 of his parts, 3419 for head and both arms, and the legs at almost 3800, so relatively chunky for a centipede here, but unfortunately that's kind of it. The only other really thing worth noting on Centipade is the very naturally high success rate on all 3 of his parts. Head at just over 1100, right arm at over 1400, and left arm at over 1200. So relatively solid in the success department. He's definitely not going to be missing a lot of enemies, but again, lack of pierce damage and relatively redundant kit makes him very severely hindered by his own utility. And the leg ability of artillery can kind of work as a double-edged sword for him, as it means if anyone does end up being faster than him, which really isn't super hard, he's going to be really feeling the pain for it. As mixed parts, though, I do have to rate him just a little bit higher at a 4.5 out of 10. While having triple redundancy is going to really hurt Centipade, if you were to possibly exchange 1 or even 2 of his parts out for something else, such as, say, break, or even going out of the scope of gravity skills, say like with long shot, rifle, hyper beam, or even something similar, then you could probably really start cooking and make the most of artillery. But that is also very severely reliant on having your shielder be the fastest on the field, because the moment your shooter takes any kind of damage with artillery in effect, they probably will not live the rest of the fight. And even though the stats on the legs are relatively solid, the leg ability of artillery is going to be kind of tricky and dangerous to use.